that were designed by Masons to follow a particular route of initiation.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a number of gardens in just outside of Paris, for instance, that if you and I were to wander through them, we would, walk down a kind of circuitous path, and then lo and behold, suddenly we'd see this giant obelisk or a giant pyramid, and then we'd descend into a grotto and move through these kind of murky waters of the grotto and follow the light. And as we move up and ascend into the light, we'd encounter another. They were called fabriques, these kind of garden designs.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very enchanting, and people went nuts for them, like Thomas Jefferson and Marie Antoinette would visit these places and think about philosophical things and a place of kind of respite. But the intention behind them, in many cases, they were designed as a kind of ritualistic subliminal message. As you walk through the garden, you are meant to encounter these things and be in awe of them, because in some way this sign would have an impact on you. And so it was a way of kind of publicly initiating people into Freemasonry without actually going through the degrees. So they took this kind of sacred space of the floor cloth, the tracing board, kind of projected it into the landscape, and in the process of doing that, they were able to kind of disseminate Masonic secrets, Masonic ideas, like Mozart did with his magic flute, like incorporated Masonic ideology, Masonic ideas into this play. So you go attend this play, and you'd be familiar with the various stages of the play, not knowing that the whole time you were getting a kind of discourse on Freemasonry. And so this innovation to actually take Freemasonry, which is entirely about architecture and about design. I mean, architecture is a way of salvation in Freemasonry, is to actually take these principles and not just enclose it in a sacred space called the Grand Lodge or the Lodge or the place where initiations take place, but putting it in a public space so that other people, perhaps even unbeknownst to them, are being introduced to the sacred mysteries of Freemasonry through these signs and whatever. That, to me, is the much more interesting side of the craft, which is not discussed. You mostly have these kind of more of a sensational angle on that. Oh, it's, to pollute your mind and whatever. And as far as I could tell, I think that the intentions, for the most part, were benevolent. Sorry, I went on a rant there.
No.
Want to edit some of that stuff out?
No, definitely not. That is very interesting, and thank you very much for sharing that. I didn't know that. And these gardens you were talking about, I mean, were these? I mean, what type of people are we? Or do you think that they were addressing here? Are these gardens in front of mansions or even castles or places, or are these just public open spaces around cities or in cities?
No. In some cases, they were public spaces, and for the most part, these gardens were private dwellings of mostly the aristocracy, and so they would be places that you would be invited to go, and if you were lucky to go, and it would be a kind of there was this very famous French philosopher named Rousseau, who said, we need to return to our kind of noble heritage. He coined something called the noble savage. He glorified the idea that, here everybody thought that in Enlightenment Europe and in this kind of great rise of science and all these great wise things and traditions, that Rousseau, who is a very important French philosophical thinker,
yes,
said, well, actually, perhaps we're regressing, because we have people that are more concerned with the frill on their dress and the type of perfume to wear, and we're not actually returning to our noble origins, and that even these savages that we're getting stories about in the Caribbean and other parts of the world, maybe those people are even more enlightened and more true to the kind of nature of being human than others. And so, and he had a large audience of people that listened to that, and so he would, one of the things he advocated is to return to nature as it is, because in the process of returning to nature as it is, we would kind of recover our true origins. And so a lot of these gardens, they look like, from the surface, they look like they are, like the common word to describe them is picturesque. Oh, they look like just these wonderful rolling hills, and you move down these hills, and there this old ruined temple. And then you walk further, and then there's this, this wonderful display of rocks. And it's supposed to look like it's been like untarnished by nature. But the fact is that it was intentionally contrived to look like nature had formed it. And that was the idea of kind of using that as a way to disseminate enlightened ideas, because he was advocating returning to the gardens. And so there was this idea of kind of returning to kind of pristine nature, is that using that as a place to, almost like a canvas to project Masonic ideas is to me an amazing innovation that we've only just begun to tap into. So people get really, I think, perhaps too enthused about things like Washington, D.C. And if, for instance, on that subject, if you did want to read a very sensible account of for instance, the U.S. Capitol building and the Masonic designs of that, I would, recommend your listeners to a particular author. It happens to be my supervisor, who wrote a very sensible architectural treatment on how the Capitol building was kind of designed to the three rooms, the Senate chamber, the rotunda, and now I forget what the other. I believe it's the old chamber. I forget what it is. Were basically a kind of symbolic way of moving through the 3 degrees of initiation, the 3 Masonic grades.
Right.
But and as I said before, there are many grades. Anyways, I'm probably getting way over ahead of myself, and I would like to talk about the building at some point.
Yeah, I know. We haven't even kind of dived into that yet. But I have a few more questions, and then let's get to it, okay?
Sure.
Because one thing you're saying here then is that the symbolism are more prevalent in a way than what we believe at first. In one regard, we can say that the people who are designing the cities or in many cases they have a background in Freemasonry, have been studying it in some way, or even being that they are coming from an educated in architecture. That means that automatically you get some of this with you, so to speak, from those schools. But there are people who would argue that these ancient rites, if we either talk about the mysteries or even the teachings themselves, argue that this is something that actually really doesn't belong to Freemasonry to begin with. Some argue that the mysteries or teachings have even been kind of hijacked, if you will, and to this day are being used and in some regard even misrepresented. Misrepresented. What would you say to that, Frank?
Well, the idea that Freemasonry is part of this tradition of the great ancient mystery cults of Egypt and Eleusis and Rome first emerged actually in Masonic literature, and it was a way of Masons kind of puffing up their own institution, saying we didn't just start with the builders of Solomon's Temple. And so if you take probably the most important piece of Masonic catechism, which is James Anderson's 1723 edition of the Constitutions of the Freemasons, he basically starts Freemasonry with Adam. Adam was the first Freemason, and then there was Noah, and all of these guys basically were given this oral tradition of God's laws into built works. And so, but to me, I don't think that there's this to me, for the most part, is Masons build, puffing up their own institution, that it came from these ancient mysteries. But if there are others that say that Freemasonry has hijacked these other ancient mystery cults, they are themselves basically falling for the Masonic advertising.
Right. Well, exactly, because what I'm thinking of here is something that Martin Short wrote about in, I think, one of his books, and he talks about this constitution that you mentioned, the Freemasonic Constitution, that in many cases actually was, as far as his research went, that was actually not, there was more kind of an invention, and there was a previous constitution that was based on what is known as the Gothic Constitution that he argued was the more kind of authentic one, and that has to do with the more of the of the real builder, so to speak. But the Freemasonic Constitution was basically if you will, an invention, and this is something that's kind of slowly has been propped up. What would you say to that?
Well, I would agree, and I think that if you were to take, for instance, a very, very popular piece of Masonic mythology is that the Masons, that the Templars are the kind of early descendants, the 12th century descendants of the Masonic craft, that they had discovered something during their researches at the stables of King Solomon's Temple, or where they thought were the stables of King Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, and the process of discovering this coveted knowledge, then eventually after being annihilated by King Philip of France, they journeyed off to Scotland and remained in hiding, only to emerge many centuries later as the Freemasons.
Yes.
So there was this idea that Freemasons are directly linked to the Templars. Now, no medievalist worth their salt would ever actually agree with that. There's a huge gap of time between the excommunication of the Templars and the first recorded Masonic initiation of the speculative variety, which was around 1647 or something like that. Now, to me, what really started and spawned this whole kind of Templar connection was this 18th century Freemason who basically gave a public speech and said, "Oh, our institution began first. You know, the Templars have held it, but they got it from the first century Gnostics, who got it from these wandering Egyptian sages and whatnot." And so it was a piece of Masonic mythology that entered into scholarship as being authoritatively true, not completely forgetting that it was this guy who invented it around 250 years ago and said that Freemasonry has everything to do with the Templars. Now, I don't want to dismiss that altogether, because I think there are way too many parallels between the Templars and the Freemasonry to think that there should be some connection. But unfortunately, and as a historian, the information is very paltry, and so I have to concede that there until we could actually find a direct lineage, the gap of time between the Templars and the Masons are way too great, and so I don't think that there's any connection between these two. I would think that if there was, we would have evidence of it, kind of like in the same way that if there was a King David the way the Bible portrays him, then surely we have some kind of historical record of this King David. But we have zero, nothing, nada. The entire Middle East, the most we've ever got on King David is one piece of ostrakhan, a basically broken fragment of pottery that has basically the three Hebrew letters for David on it. And then people go, "Oh my gosh, it's evidence of King David." It's like, wait a second.
Right.
King David is way too prolific a king. He had the territory all over the place. If we follow the Bible, surely we should have more than this. We have everything on some nobody Egyptian mayor in some outpost town in the Upper Nile. We have tons of him and tons of other nobodies in the ancient world. Surely we should have something on David or Moses or even Solomon, and we have nothing. And the same thing is with the Templars. We have zero connecting them with the Masons, other than a lot of conjecture and a lot of Masonic mythologizing and in ritual that makes that connection.
Well, right. Well, exactly. But what kind of questions, do you ask to that then in that regard? Because does that mean that they're just trying to prop up the order for the sake of it, or to offer these mysteries or symbols, or would you argue that this is just, these stories aren't to be meant to be taken literal, but this is about a teaching or to relay information regarding these kings, and they're not really looked upon as historical characters or figures per se? What do you think?
I think that if you or I were interested in joining a secret society that apparently had coveted knowledge that came directly from God,